Everyone. My name is Lori Peak, and I serve as the director of the Natural Hazard Center in the Institute of Behavioral Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the monthly Making Mitigation Work webinar series, which is hosted by the Natural Hazard Center and made possible with the support of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the National Science Foundation. This webinar series highlights recent progress in mitigation policy, practice, and research. We are so grateful that you have made the time to join with us today for what promises to be a lively and provocative discussion with some of our nation's leading hazard mitigation planners and community resilience champions. A few announcements before we begin the formal webinar panel. This forum is being recorded. The caption video recording and presentation slides from today's webinar will be posted online at the Natural Hazard Center website, hazards.colorado.edu. This is also where you can find the recordings and supplemental materials from the prior Making Mitigation Work webinars, as well as access to many other free resources for researchers and practitioners. Thanks to a partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, we can offer one contact hour of emergency management training through the IAEM certification program. To receive the credit, you are required to attend the entire webinar session today. Please visit the Making Mitigation Work webpage under the Trainings tab at hazards.colorado.edu for more information. And you can contact Katie Murphy at hazctr@colorado.edu for more information on receiving your certificate for attending today's webinar. If at any point during the presentation you have questions or comments, you can offer those either via the chat function or the Q&A box on Zoom. We will monitor the questions in both places, and our panel will respond to questions as time permits today. Now, without further ado, I am so excited to introduce today's panel for our discussion regarding the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. Because it has been 20 years since the passage of DMA 2K and October is National Community Planning Month, we decided to use this month's webinar session as an opportunity to bring together a group of extraordinarily talented and committed hazard mitigation planners to help us take stock of the promise, pitfalls, and progress associated with DMA 2K. Jim Schwab, who is principal at Jim Schwab Consulting and who has led a storied career, will serve as our moderator and guide today. He will be joined by Robin Fenig, who's the State Hazard Mitigation Officer for Wisconsin Emergency Management, Derek Hebert, who's a hazard mitigation strategist with King County Emergency Management in Washington, and Shanine Thomas, who's with Fema. I could go on and on about each one of these four panelists, but in the interest of time, I am going to turn this over to Jim now, who is going to take a few minutes to orient us and to offer an overview of how the panel will work today. Jim, over to you. Oh, and Jim, I think you are still muted.
Thank you. Good point. We're going to do a pretty rapid overview of the 20 years of the Disaster Mitigation Act. If we can go to the next slide. I'm going to start with a short timeline of the events that have led to where we are now. As 20 years would suggest, it was back in the year 2000, right at the turn of the century, that Congress passed the Disaster Mitigation Act, PL 106-390, and that was signed into law by President Clinton. It took a couple of years to, as it often does, develop the rules and publish in the Federal Register what the guidance was going to be for implementing this. And so that was accomplished by a final rule publication in the Code of Federal Regulations by Fema back in 2002. And shortly thereafter, the first plans started to roll out from states and local governments. And they've been on a recurring cycle ever since, all the way to today and on into future years, we certainly hope. We'll talk about that in a moment. One interesting change came back in 2013, about 10 years after that, with the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act, which for the first time provided for state approval authority for mitigation plans, which otherwise require direct approval by FEMA. And then in 2018, the last point we will make, Congress also passed, as part of an omnibus bill that covered a number of other things, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, which included provisions for reforming the mode of pre-disaster mitigation funding and giving it a much more focused approach that we'll discuss shortly and throughout the questions from the panel as well. So if we can go to the next slide. Very quickly, what the Disaster Mitigation Act accomplished in terms of the legislation and rules. Many of you are quite familiar with this, I'm sure, but just to give the overview, the biggest single thing was tying the eligibility of states and local governments, local government units of various sorts, for FEMA mitigation grants to their adoption of a state or local hazard mitigation plan that was approved by FEMA. What I call no plan, no money. Before that, that level of accountability had not been in place, but Congress had decided that we needed to achieve that kind of accountability in terms of planning. The law also established something known as PDM, pre-disaster mitigation. We had already had something called Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP, which depended on your having a disaster to get money to do mitigation, at least the federal money that would supplement whatever you were doing locally. Whereas this set up a grant program for mitigation in the absence of a disaster, but we'll talk about that momentarily as well. It provided for state administration of these hazard mitigation plans and the programs to make them consistent between state and local plans. In that federal rulemaking created a methodology and some requirements through those rules and guidance for how those plans would be developed. Set up a 5-year cycle, so state and local plans must be updated every 5 years, otherwise they expire, and provided some provisions for additional funding for states with something known as enhanced mitigation plans, which we'll also discuss shortly. This is where states kind of go an extra mile beyond the basic requirements. So if we can go to the next slide, we will transition to what the impact of all that was. As of now, 20 years later, all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 territories, including Puerto Rico, have FEMA-approved state mitigation plans. So we've gotten a universal achievement on that front. 14 of those states have those enhanced mitigation plans. That gives them additional funding for mitigation beyond the 15% that they would otherwise get. It goes up to 20% if they do the better plans. 6 states have achieved that authority to approve the local mitigation plans under that Sandy Recovery Improvement Act. But the real penetration is down at the local level. We have 25,100 local governments that just checked on the FEMA website last night that have approved or waiting to be adopted hazard mitigation plans. So that's the level of compliance on this. 240 tribal governments that have approved plans for their tribal jurisdictions. And that means that 87% of the US population now lives in jurisdictions that are covered by some sort of state or some sort of local or tribal plan within those states. So if we can switch to the next slide. This gives you the map from, as of June 30th this year, from FEMA. And as you can see, those various shades of blue are places that have approved plans or approved pending adoption, or they may be expiring within 90 days, in which case they best get their new plan submitted. Yellow, which looks to me largely like very rural areas in most cases, are those that have expired plans, and just a few spots where you've got that gray without a plan. So that gives you kind of a picture of the overall geographic coverage. And then we'll go to the last slide. And we wanted to finish this overview by mentioning the newest development, the new kid on the block in terms of programmatic efforts by Fema to address mitigation, which is that 2 years ago when Congress passed the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, one of its provisions authorized an infrastructure grant program to replace PDM, which really had been up and down and very reliant on congressional annual appropriations. That has completely changed. This is now a fixed percentage of overall disaster relief allocations nationwide for a given year. FEMA goes in, sweeps out that, and gives out a 6% share of that for the new program, which is now known as BRIC, which stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. They've issued the new guidelines just a couple of months ago, and the new funding, which is considerably well better than sometimes 25 million, sometimes 100 million, somewhere in that range, from going up and down from year to year. This is now $500 million in grants funding that is available to the communities that are applying for those grants right now. So that basically gives us our overview and some idea of what kinds of topics we're going to discuss in terms of what difference has this all made. And so at this point, I'm going to switch to our questions for the panel. What we're going to do is ask a series of questions, and in each case, I'm going to direct it initially to one of our panelists, with the other two having an opportunity to weigh in if they wish. And we'll start with Derek with the question, after 20 years of the Disaster Mitigation Act, is mitigation planning producing enough value for our states, tribes, and communities? And is it changing and evolving fast enough to meet their needs and their current challenges? So Derek?
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you very much, Lori, for giving me the opportunity to be on here with these esteemed colleagues from around the country. So this is an interesting question. So Washington State is the first state in the country to have an enhanced mitigation plan from, way back in 2006, I think it was. And I used to be the state hazard mitigation planner before I came to King County. The short answer to this is no, but I think that that has a lot to do more with how jurisdictions have chosen to use the planning process. I think a lot of times communities are afraid of the regulations, so they feel like they have to design a planning process built entirely around meeting regulations and requirements, whereas you can actually meet a lot of those regulations and requirements through a planning process that is much more designed to accommodate your goals. The other piece, of course, is contractor related to contractor written plans, and I think though that's not. I think that can sometimes cause some challenges as well. But I think really this is one of those cases where the process really is as important as the plan itself. Something FEMA always says, and is definitely true in this case. The communities can get more out of the process. They should, but it's about making sure that they put some skin in the game when it comes to writing plans, and not just looking at the requirements, being concerned about those requirements, and trying to write the plans just for the purpose of getting a grant. If getting a grant because you have a plan is the only metric you use to judge success for mitigation planning, I think there's probably a lot of planning dollars that have been wasted.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Thank you, Jim, and good comments, Derek, and I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you said. Just on the evolving component, is planning evolving enough to meet the current needs and challenges. And I'm just going to recall back to where 2004, having to lug around buckets and buckets of materials to try to meet the requirements. I think that evolution of a lot of the information is online now. A lot of the information you can get from various sources quickly versus waiting months for someone to send you a document through the mail. I think that part is evolving quite well. And then the fact that a lot of paper plans back early on, 2004 timeframe to now, they're not as big as they used to be. Some of them are more complex with better data. So that evolution component is like optimal and successful in my eyes, but we do still have a long way to go.
Yeah, I would definitely echo those things. And I think one thing that I think about the evolution of planning is how we're training the future generations of planners. I think I feel very fortunate when I was at the University of Iowa to have taken a class that was specifically designed for hazard mitigation and disaster recovery planning. And Jim was, of course, my professor back in the day for that. A quick plug for those of you who are interested. But I think that that planning curriculum, and I think about the changes in AICP accreditation and some of the topics that our future planners are studying right now, I think that they're becoming more prevalent. And I think that planners are understanding that we do have an active role as practitioners to play in the planning process and making it more about that process, like Derek mentioned. So I think that was a really good answer, Derek. Thanks for sharing that perspective.
Okay, well, I'm going to follow up that with the question that flows pretty much logically out of there. One recurring issue has been a tendency in some states toward what is occasionally called cookie cutter mitigation plans, things that copy a lot of ingredients from one place to another, often produced by consulting firms, sometimes master planning contracts from the state. How can we foster a more thorough planning process at the state, tribal, and local level? And what would make such a process more attractive to communities? And I think this time we'll start with Shanine.
Yeah, that led right on into that, didn't it? So, you know, it's a complicated subject with contractor-driven plans and how the states like to spend their money. I applaud those states who actually look to get a template or a preferred way to do it so the locals can understand what exactly the state needs to implement into the state hazard mitigation plan and then other planning mechanisms in general. The problem comes into play when you have cookie cutter plans is it doesn't always address the needs of that local community. You know, if you have a list of just tons and tons of information that might not be relative to that community, it's difficult for that community to find what they need, what's really beneficial, and how is that going to help them in the long run, whether it's grant funding or other planning mechanisms. So instead of just regurgitating the same data over and over again, we've got to educate the local governments, the tribal governments, and even some of our state partners on how to use information in the plan, how to incorporate it in the plan so it can, one, address like the project grants, the project applications. When it comes to benefit cost analysis requirements, a lot of the planning requirements can be utilized in the development of good benefit cost analyses and positive benefit cost analyses, as well as other components like wildfire assessments and flood assessment tools, all those tools that are necessary to help communities succeed, not only in planning, not only in grants, but any type of community development, any kind of advancement they're wanting, budgeting, all those components can be in the plan. And you just don't quite get those components when everything is cookie cutter and it looks exactly the same, because none of the communities are exactly the same.
Very good point. Anyone else? Robin?
I think in Wisconsin, so I'm speaking from the perspective of being a state hazard mitigation officer. In Wisconsin, we do have a program administration by state's agreement with FEMA Region 5 to approve all of our county and tribal mitigation plans. So we get to see a lot of them, obviously. We have 72 counties and 12 tribes. So we see a lot of plans pretty regularly. And I think for me, the counties and tribes in our state that do, to me, the best job of having a more inclusive planning process are the counties and tribes that are partnering between their emergency management and their planning and zoning departments. We have, I think there's a lot of pressure on emergency managers, especially with COVID response, falling largely to emergency managers to take care of. I think that the more, community departments that are involved in the process, especially those who are trained in planning process, can really help make the planning process a lot stronger. I think a lot of the, advancement in mitigation planning that we're seeing, at least in FEMA Region 5, are actually coming from our tribal nations and our tribal partners. I want to point out, if you're looking for good examples in Wisconsin, the Forest County Potawatomi tribe, in their risk assessment, their asset industry included not just critical facilities that you'd see in those cookie cutter plans like your police and EMS stations, but also things with historical and community significance. And that also helps them identify projects that can help mitigate risk against those important parts of their heritage and their communities. Also in Minnesota, the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, they discussed the impacts not just to natural hazards and climate change, but they also thought about how those hazards impact wild rice yields. In disasters in 2014, 2012, we saw a lot of impacts to wild rice fields in our tribal nations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and there's an example of a tribe that's kind of going above and beyond. And then the last one I'll mention is the Mille-Lac Band of Ojibwe in Minnesota. And actually their risk assessment, because in the risk assessment process, you include, your natural hazards, but they chose to include other natural hazards. Even though FEMA and the state don't necessarily evaluate those the same way, using your risk assessment as an opportunity to think about what hazards actually impact your community is really impactful. And specifically, the band included historical trauma, that chronic unresolved trauma transmitted through generations, and that manifests to their tribe in symptoms like public health and unemployment, impacts. And even though FEMA doesn't necessarily review historical trauma as a hazard the way they would a flood, it starts to spark that conversation in the planning process for the tribe. And I'm really impressed by some of our tribes going above and beyond those requirements.
Okay. Oh.
So I think that comment on the wild rice fields is really telling about how mitigation planning should be done. It's an asset-based approach is that you should use. You should look at what's most critical to the functioning, to the lifestyle, to the quality of life of your community, and you should think about how to make that more resilient, protect it, what it's threatened by, and you should build your planning process around that. So I think that example, Robin, was absolutely spot on. And I did want to add a little bit to this question. And I won't recap my previous response, but what I'll say is that most contractors I know actually do care, but what they quickly realize is that jurisdictions, many of them just want an approved plan and they don't really want the process that goes with it. And I don't want to put the whole onus on them because a lot of times jurisdictions are trying to get what they see as the requirement satisfied. Secret is, of course, mitigation plans are not a requirement for anything except for mitigation grants at the local level. You still get PA categories because of the state plan, and you don't really need the mitigation plan unless you're going for the grants or you want to take advantage of the mitigation planning process. Now, I say that because I think a community should really be prepared to engage in the process if you want to take advantage of, if you want to make this a worthwhile effort for you. That's where the strategic value of the mitigation planning is. That's where you're designing a plan based around strategic outcomes that you want to accomplish. And contractors can really help this. But I think that we can't really expect contractors to write the plans for us. They can provide technical assistance. They can facilitate a process, but they are not the planners for us in a very real sense. They are facilitators. They can be writers. And the way we get away from this is by first and foremost, kind of not giving a single planning grant, like, $3 million of PDM to 90 of the 90-something counties in the state of Nebraska, I think went to like a single contractor at one point. That's ridiculous. So we avoid that and we try to make sure that we spread it around, we diversify our contractor base, and then we make our communities really put some effort into what they're going to do within the process, not just say we're just going to get a contractor to write the plan for us.
Really great points there, Derek. Thank you. I'm going to follow up with Robin this time as a starter. And this is truly the 2020 question. Social and racial equity have emerged as huge themes in recent years, and especially this year. Does either the Disaster Mitigation Act or the new BRIC grant program do enough to address questions of disaster equity in either the mitigation or recovery planning process? And if not, why?
So I generally don't think that any piece of legislation or set of requirements is going to address equity in the mitigation or recovery planning process. I think Derek and Shanine have mentioned that just because a community has a plan, it doesn't mean that the process is engaging marginalized voices in the community and providing that personalized opportunity to participate. And to be honest, there's no requirements for recovery planning at all. And I think because of that, there's really there's a lack between the tie between mitigation and recovery planning. I think that rather than pointing to, saying this is a 2020 issue, I think we know as planners that it's been an issue since Katrina and Superstorm Sandy largely because those events forced a lot of folks to look at, day after day, that national level news media to see that intersection between race, income, mobility, and who was impacted with the disasters. I also say those two events in particular because I think out of those two events, we saw a fundamental shift in how the hazard mitigation assistance and the public assistance grant programs were carried out. I think we do focus a lot on the hazard mitigation, process, both from the planning and the grant side. But to me, I think we're missing a lot of opportunities in the public assistance program. I'm not sure how familiar folks are on this webinar actually going through the process as a community. Prior to becoming the state hazard mitigation officer, I was a public assistance officer, so managing this program at the state level. And there really are no requirements for recovery planning or to connect your mitigation plan to, the process of working with a FEMA representative in your community. The FEMA reps, called program delivery managers or PDMGs, they're not well trained to provide technical expertise in disaster recovery from a community standpoint. They're given some pretty minimal training to help you get through the hoops of meeting requirements in public assistance. A Wisconsin community, I'd say, described this public assistance process as a number of gotcha opportunities. And FEMA really emphasizes returning infrastructure back to pre-disaster condition and function. And that hardly helps us think about how to, cut losses and become more resilient, especially with lifelines that are emphasized in the BRIC program. And to be honest, unless a community is really well versed in the exact FEMA jargon that they need to say to get the assistance they need, they're not going to get what they need to actually recover from an event, let alone think about its successful mitigation. And so to me, what I see a lot, at least, in Wisconsin and other states nearby, and we also see across the country, is that we have communities that are often hit over and over and over again with the same type of disaster, whether that's a hurricane, whether it's coastal flooding, riverine flooding, wildfires. And we have folks who are getting grant money to pay for this, to repair the same sites and infrastructure over and over again. And we're seeing a lot of communities declaring bankruptcy because they can't afford to do that anymore. And in practice, I think that communities are getting poorer and poorer and losing a lot of capacity. And on the other end of the spectrum, large communities that have a lot of capacity, GIS systems, engineers on staff, high fiscal ratings, and having passionate local champions that have the capacity and energy to push equity conversations, if it's even there. They're often white folks, they're not people of color, and they seem to be in an advantage to recovering and focusing not on the equity issues. And I think that, there's a lot of opportunities in BRIC, changing how the funding is allocated between priorities and project types. I think that there's hope for future grant cycles, but to me, it's just not there right now. And honestly, until we connect the planning process, the mitigation planning process to the recovery projects, not just mitigation grants, and we change how the assistance is actually delivered to our communities, we're not going to tackle equity.
Yeah, Jim. I think that Robin's final statement right there, that it's really the recovery piece that we're seeing some of the greatest increases in inequity. I would say that a lot of FEMA programs, they cause inequity, specifically things like the way that SBA, Small Business Administration Disaster Loan Program, works causes inequity. Great example coming out of Jacksonville from a few years ago, where you had a predominantly white suburb, and a predominantly Black part of the city that were both damaged, and the metrics were flipped. You had something like 26% rate of approval of loans in the city and like 80-something% in the suburb, and notably the amount invested in the suburb was like 2.6 million, and the amount invested in the city was 26,000. This is real transfer of public dollars into communities. This is what it is. It's wealth transfer. It's income transfer. It is, and it is what builds one place up over another. So I want to say first and foremost, like, of course, DMA 2K didn't do enough. I think it accepted implicitly the idea that disasters are the great equalizers, something we know not to be true. I do want to say, though, that BRIC has, for the first time, done something that my county, for example, has been advocating for a while, and I've been working on for a while, which is enshrining the equity principles into how projects are prioritized and funded. I understand that this seems really technical. It seems kind of silly when you're looking at it. Like, how can the incorporation of a single component of prioritization in the BRIC program result in a real sea change in who gets what and where things are invested? But I want to say that priorities, in the history of this country, priorities are more important than total resource availability. The federal government and state governments didn't really do the kind of large-scale public works that we do today a century ago. There wasn't the big public works programs. There weren't the big agencies doing huge investments. There wasn't a FEMA kind of equivalent 100 years ago. So we've created the high level of inequity, especially the differential experience of disasters. We've created a lot of this, and we have the capacity in a lot of cases to build our way out of it. We know we have the engineering ability to build our way out of it in a lot of cases, if not buy people out and move them or help introduce other kinds of mitigation. But I think the way you reduce this inequity and start dealing with the problem is through balancing, through prioritization, and BRIC does that. So is it enough? No. You're going to need You're going to need recovery programs to actually serve everyone before we can even begin approaching long-term disasters, since so many of these losses are repetitive losses. But I think we have a step in the right direction. And with more process in this, we're gonna be able to start making a dent, especially if we can get this kind of process and this prioritization in the recovery programs as well.
Okay, well, this is a great way to shift gears to Shanine with the next question, I think. How well do existing FEMA tools for assessing the merits of mitigation projects, such as benefit cost analysis, serve low-income and small impoverished communities? And what barriers exist in the FEMA assistance and regulatory systems to achieving those equity goals? How can they best be removed?
Well, I'll say this, we don't do a good job at, making sure that a lot of our programs as a whole, not just mitigation, but recovery, response, preparedness, all these areas that FEMA and emergency management entail, we don't really have a whole lot of mechanisms specifically for low income or small impoverished communities, etc. Most of those communities are already stretched to their limits. So when we introduce new types of products and new programs or new methods, they're not always welcome received, but they're typically not well received with regular communities, your prominent communities, your advanced communities. It's a hard subject. It's a hard subject to talk about. It's a hard subject to get people to understand, especially when they have no experience in the matter, or they think it doesn't exist, like the disparaging components don't exist. And that education piece, I don't know how, as a FEMA employee or how FEMA as an entity can do it alone. One start would be for local communities and local emergency managers up to state hazard mitigation officers, looking at those local priorities and then influencing the state priorities to see how those grant applications can be prioritized and reprioritized. It starts from the local level to the state level, and then by the time it gets to FEMA, our prioritization method hopefully has already incorporated that prioritization method of the local and the state government to enhance those small and impoverished communities or those underserved areas. So you've got that part, and then you have the part that comes into play about like tribal communities. We've been focusing on state governments for as long as DMA 2K has been around. It was state centric and local centric, and just in recent years, that shift in the tribal government about how to build emergency management in tribal governments. We've got the legislation and the regulation that changed, adding the tribal regulations. Those pieces as well were left in the dark. So it's about evolution, it's about changing, it's about being open to the discussion, for one. And then one piece about BRIC that I'm really excited about is that technical assistance, direct non-financial technical assistance. That piece I think is key. But the problem is there's only one jurisdiction per region. So if people are interested, if like the states and the planners and other grant writers are interested in that and think that that's a low number, because in my eyes, that's a low number, but I don't get to make that change. You need to be saying, hey, we need more of that direct technical assistance, that non-financial assistance to help these small and impoverished communities, these tribal governments, bring them up to speed, build capacity and capability. And that's all what that portion is about. And until we kind of work together as a whole, and I know it's like, oh, everyone needs to work together and skip through the fields all happily, but we're going to have to get in the weeds and be uncomfortable. And you have to bring it to our attention, to FEMA's attention. You have to bring it to your legislators' attention. Otherwise, it will just keep going by the wayside and we'll just keep floating along without addressing the problem.
Okay, Robin?
Yeah, I was going to say, so I guess specifically about FEMA's benefit cost analysis requirements and the tools, I think I have a lot of very, very strong opinions about this. I think that there's three things that I'll touch on. One is I think that, so the fact that FEMA is required to use a tool in every single project has to have this demonstrated cost effectiveness requirement. A lot of communities don't have the capacity, knowledge, or expertise to do the required benefit cost analysis. And they tend to go for projects where there's calculated benefit memorandums or other ways to meet cost effectiveness because it's easier. So therefore, we're doing these, a lot of communities are doing piecemeal acquisition, demolition projects because they don't have the capacity or support to really do a benefit cost analysis. The second thing is our benefit cost analysis process does not actually include all of the benefits. FEMA has been hosting these BRIC webinars series, I think it was in July. All the webinars that they've done to announce BRIC and get people really excited about BRIC started pushing all of these projects for all hazards. So there's like this community mitigation action portfolio with example projects. To me, the problem is these non-floodplain buyouts, non-elevation, non-community safe room, really, to me, easy BCAs for a state to help with. The really nitty gritty where you need a lot of documentation and a lot of information to actually do a benefit cost analysis. We can't include all the benefits like economic impact, where there's a lot of established methodology outside of FEMA to tell us how to do economic impact analyses. We can't include economic impacts to the benefits or the costs. We can't look at things like environmental benefits. To a certain degree we can for certain types of wetland restoration or riparian areas for green space, but we can't think about things like improved air quality or, better access to education in the middle of a COVID crisis where everyone's virtual schooling for fiber lines and things like that. Like it's the portfolio right now that FEMA's celebrating and wanting applications for, they're not funded by FEMA. They're funded by other federal projects. And we're setting up this expectation that, oh, we can apply for this. But when as a state, I have to say, well, there's a benefit cost analysis requirement. I feel like FEMA's kind of left the benefit cost analysis part to the states to provide all the technical assistance, jump through all the hoops and really help communities, because otherwise communities don't have that knowledge. And then the last thing is I think the tool itself is not very intuitive. If you've actually used FEMA's actual tool, I think the previous version of the tool, even though it was a bigger file size, kind of clunky and slow, it was more intuitive and it walked you through the process. It's now an Excel-based tool, so it's more accessible theoretically if you have the Microsoft Office suite, but it's not as intuitive walking a user through the process. I could probably talk for an hour about benefit cost analysis right now, just because I'm in the middle of those BRIC applications. But I'll, for the sake of shortness, I will cut it off and let Derek chime in.
Oh man.
Actually, I'm going to go ahead and ask the next question because it goes to Derek anyway, and then he can fill in where he pleases in the interest of moving things along, which is what state, tribal, and local activities have been helping to integrate justice and equity considerations into hazard mitigation planning, and are there models worth adapting elsewhere?
Well, I will kind of give a quick answer to Robin's question Robin was talking about a moment ago, and because it kind of leads into this, and that is that the BCA actually also actively promotes inequity. It's based on higher cash value for things. So if you protect 100 homes worth $100,000, you're going to get a lower BCA than a similarly exposed area with $1 million homes. That's just not right. It's not consistent with reality. And in regards to capturing extra benefits, we have an air traffic control tower that adds literally billions of dollars to the economy because Boeing flies its planes from the rented manufacturing facility out of there. And it's going to fall down in the earthquake for sure. And it's the value in terms of response and economic recovery are not calculable for us. There's only 4 controllers, and they're only worth $7,500,000 each. And the project costs more than $28 million, and their lives are $7,500,000. So, well, the project's not cost effective. So it's kind of a pain to see that, and I agree with Robin. But this is my favorite consideration and question, and this is really why I have continued to stick with mitigation. My background's in urban planning, but mitigation is where I continue to spend essentially all of my time in emergency management. And that is because hazard mitigation is the perfect place to focus on equity. Hazards have you look at your community's assets, you consider threats, you consider susceptibility, and you develop strategies to protect those assets. Fitting in equity considerations into this process is essentially second nature for us now in King County, but is something any jurisdiction can do because it gives you this opportunity to try to expand your understanding of what's important to your community. And it also it humanizes infrastructure, if you will. So what we do is we take our 14 determinants of equity, which are these basically 14 components of quality of life, things like access to safe and healthy food systems or transportation, and we look at our mitigation strategies, and we link our mitigation strategies closely with these different different components of quality of life. Everything we do feeds up into one of these. So when we do a school seismic retrofit or integrate earthquake early warning into the intercom system of a school, we're not retrofitting a building. We're ensuring equitable access to education. This is an opportunity to ensure that this building is going to be able to serve a community, and because of who benefits and who needs these things, because of whose buildings tend to be a little bit older, because of where infrastructure investment has happened in the past, we're able to kind of push these projects, at least conceptually, toward districts that are serving maybe a more vulnerable part of the population. And by vulnerable, I should say, and this is a big piece for us, we mean likelihood of loss and likelihood of delayed recovery time. Vulnerability should not be considered as it's kind of is too broad of a thing, because every different discipline is going to have to think about vulnerability a little bit different. And if you want to be successful in trying to target hazard risk mitigation, hazard resilience recovery programs, you need to think about vulnerability in terms of hazards, not in terms of, say, public health crises and other things. Those are completely legitimate, but you don't want to conflate things to a point where you can't see the truth. And by the truth, I mean vulnerability has causes. Likelihood of loss and likelihood delayed recovery has causes, and so you don't want to concatenate all of these into a single score and say this place has a vulnerability of 7. Yeah, good luck planning for that. Good luck mitigating 7. What you're trying to do instead is say, what are the things that contribute to vulnerability? What are the root causes here? And then you take things like race and ethnicity and you apply them as an equity overlay. So we don't use vulnerability indices by concatenating everything and then saying, well, here's your vulnerable areas, because also we've noticed that these places It effectively vulnerability redlines places. If I apply the SOVI, for example, to Washington State census tracts, I highlight my locations of Native American tribes, of indigenous communities, because those reservations have their own census tracts. And because of the presence of indigenous populations, they are automatically considered vulnerable. This doesn't help me when I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to invest. So that's another piece. We try to understand root causes of vulnerability. And it's a key component of integrating equity into mitigation plans is to understand why people are likely to suffer loss and recover slowly, because that's going to feed into what mitigation strategies you apply. You use race and ethnicity and other things as an overlay to make sure that when you invest, you are being fair and you are being equitable, but you make sure to not create a forest out of trees and not be able to see the actual root causes of things. We also look at promoting and prioritizing mitigation investments based on the likelihood of loss and likelihood of recovery, of delayed recovery for these communities. So there's a score in our mitigation prioritization method where we look at population vulnerabilities and population impacts. It's also part of things like partnerships. And so you can get, if you design a project in partnership with an impacted community, and the project is designed with that community in mind specifically, you're able to get a much better score on your project prioritization than you would have by itself. It actually mirrors the FEMA process almost identically, but we made ours first, and then so maybe there was some information sharing there. I'll hope so. But it was really nice to see that partnership come out in the NOFO. And in any case, the final piece is really plan integration. And that is that when you're looking at social and physical vulnerability incorporated in the comprehensive plan into how you make planning policies for your jurisdiction, you again are trying to kind of get things out of this kind of huge scale vulnerable populations tag, and instead look at individual causes. Mobile homes are the root cause of loss of life in tornadoes. We know this because they're responsible for up to like almost 50% of tornado fatalities, and they're 7% of the nation's housing stock. So there's your root cause. And if you want to solve a problem like that, you have to target the root cause. You can't look at it's not the characteristics necessarily of the people living in them. It's the fact they live in those facilities, and making investments that reduce that risk and address that threat are going to be what helps you there. So this is kind of a big piece. There's a few jurisdictions that are making progress on this. King County, obviously, we've really taken a strong interest in integrating equity and social justice into how we run our mitigation program. But even like the Harris County Flood Control District in Houston area is now actively prioritizing projects based in part on social vulnerability scores. FEMA obviously has it in the BRIC program, and I just heard that the CDBG program for Texas Community Development Block Grant is incorporating it and how they prioritize risk money for mitigation. And tomorrow, I think there's a NOAA webinar that's got people like Catherine Fox on there talking about this. So I think this is the way of the future. It's where you put the assets, and that is identified through the hazard mitigation planning process.
Okay, in the interest of time, to make sure we have some opportunity for questions, I'm going to direct our final question to Robin, and we'll try and keep this brief, but where are there bright spots with regard to innovations among tribal and low income, low capacity or minority communities in achieving mitigation planning goals that rise above and beyond expectations?
I think, honestly, I think the brightest spots are the communities who utilize the planning process. And I think that's a theme you're still tuning in, you've heard throughout the entire webinar, all three of us have said, is it really comes down to having an engaged planning process, to have those conversations about what your community needs. You know, where does the community have vulnerability? What does the risk look like? What's the way forward? And I think the same applies for recovery planning. But to me, the communities that have the most valuable planning processes, both for mitigation and recovery planning, are the ones that have actually gone through events, that have gone through, you know, losses and the process of having to figure out how to move forward and what that way forward looks like. I think it's hard, especially for low capacity communities, to see value in the process unless they've gone through events. And that's where we see, I think, locally, you'll find a champion who takes a hold of that planning process. In a lot of cases, you know, it is in the emergency management field, because they're the ones who are walking through the process of recovery grants and, you know, exercising and training, you know, the whole cycle all the time with their communities. And I think of in Ashland County, it's a county in northern Wisconsin. The county emergency manager is one of the most passionate and energetic humans I've ever met. She's gone through maybe 10 events in the last 8 years, like historic level floods every single year almost. It's just getting worse and worse. Obviously, we know there's reasons for that, but she still is applying for grants. She's thinking holistically. She's out there working and building the relationships. But I think that prior to her going through those repetitive events, she didn't know how to do the process. And now she is a boss at that process. Dorothy Tank, if you're listening, I don't know if she's there. She's one of the most dynamic emergency managers I've gotten to work with in Wisconsin. I also think about, we had a former tribal emergency manager who passed away a few years ago, but kind of before he passed, he was able to take his big goal was how do we get more, you know, backup generators for our tribe, the Stockbridge Munsee tribe. And he was able to think, how can I get, you know, more protection from folks like Derek was just talking about in our most vulnerable housing stock in our community, provide a safe place for them. So he leveraged the benefit cost analysis game. Like he was able to show that if we save life and provide a community safe room for our mobile homes, we can also use that to leverage getting additional generators. I think they got 7 additional generators for the community based on the benefits leveraged from getting a 210 capacity tornado shelter in their county, or sorry, in their tribe. And that was huge for them. And without Roger to carry that process through, you know, that the community doesn't get that opportunity. And so we have, to me, examples of folks that champion the process, and they've been through the events and they know how to do it. I would love to see, to me, the biggest opportunity is how do we take the FEMA Public Assistance Program, which is the biggest of disaster funding opportunities, how do we turn that into a real recovery program? How do we have a conversation with someone from FEMA at the table who says, let me look at your mitigation plan. How does this project connect to other plans? How does this project actually feed into your community recovery as opposed to trying to segment it off and doing something that's just looking at how do I fix this one culvert that washed out? And I'd love to see that. And I think that as these champions get more and more passionate and go through more and more events, we're going to see change. And it gets to what Shanine said, you know, people contacting their legislators, their representatives. It's those champions that are the ones who have the skills, the stories, and the data to back up why we need these changes.
Yeah, Jim, if I could just add on to a bright spot. Back when I was at the state, there were bright spots because I got to contribute a lot more to just the local governments and how the state prioritized components of mitigation and response and recovery, et cetera. Now at the federal level, it's a little difficult to get in that like mix of priorities. But on the tribal side, it's great. It's awesome to see a tribe that when they first started coming to FEMA asking about, hey, we've got this hazard mitigation plan requirement, then they take that plan requirement and they turn it into declaring a direct disaster declaration. Then from that, the declaration, they take that and then they implement mitigation in those public assistance projects that they've now got the money for. And then from that point, they go on and they hire more people. They reinvest into the tribal community where just 3 to 4 years ago, they had nowhere to turn. They really didn't know what to do. They were confused about a lot of our FEMA products. So that piece right there for me is like the brightest spot every day. And that's why I continue to come to work and try to influence communities in general, and then those tribal communities, since I do get that direct government to government access to those.
Great. So on that brilliant positive finish, Lori, do we have any questions?
Well, so Jim, I have to say that people have been chiming in the chat box for the entire session. I think have been deeply engaged. So I see some specific ones that we can answer here. So I guess what I would say to, if you are out there right now, we have about 3 minutes for questions. So if you have a specific question you'd like to raise, will you pop that back into the chat box so it's at the start so Jim can see it?
Okay.
And Shanine, I can go ahead and direct one very specific one that came into you. One of our panelists or participants wanted to know about identifying the 10 FEMA region community preparedness leads because they were having a hard time finding that information on the website. So kind of more broadly, I know you're not going to give out 10 emails right now, but more broadly, if people are looking to connect with FEMA, to get resources with people on the ground, what's your recommendation for finding our FEMA colleagues? Thank you.
The easiest is to go to each FEMA region's webpage and then use the external affairs component in, so it'll be like contact FEMA region, whatever. In my case, it's FEMA region 6. And each region has an email address that goes directly to external affairs. You ask that question and external affairs will distribute it to the appropriate individual or division. But I can get you a list of preparedness officers. And I'll send it to you, Lori, and you can distribute.
Thank you. And just so all the participants on the webinar know what we do with this wonderful chat box. So Katie Murphy goes through that and she does call out the questions. And so to the specific questions that are in there, we will make sure get them to the panelists and get you responses that then we then post on the website. So Jim, in the last minute or two, I know there are some big questions that got added in there. Do you want to try to tackle one?
Sure. Here's a very interesting one from Jasper Cook. It seems like the most effective planning process locally is one that integrates all the existing plans. Boy, that's been a topic in my career. What does that look like at the state level? Can FEMA, for example, combine the THIRA and mitigation planning requirements? You know, I'll leave it at that and see what we get for feedback here.
Jasper, I love that question. I feel like I've answered I tried to answer a couple questions that you said privately. But in Wisconsin, we actually, our risk assessment for our state hazard mitigation plan is directly, like all the natural hazards directly are included into our THIRA. So we kind of have this like very cool relationship between our state THIRA when it comes to natural hazards. And I feel like our state planning is pretty well integrated between our THIRA and state mitigation plan because of that relationship. We also, the person who's in charge of the THIRA at our state used to work in mitigation. So I think that also helps use a really, I think, key component in helping get us to be on the same page there.
Okay. Here's an interesting old time question from Rich Ross. In the early days of DMA 2K, local emergency managers felt that planners were trying to take their jobs and did not like including planners in the process. How has this changed?
So I can talk a little bit to this one. Oh, sorry, Shanine. Do you want to go ahead? Oh, okay. So there's some places that this should be, that planning departments are really well equipped to run mitigation planning activities. In other cases, they're not, and planning departments are can be quite insular and just focused on land use code regulations and permitting and things like that. What I would suggest is that it depends on your department. I see more problems of integration where planners could actually benefit from bringing emergency managers along with them in some of the planning process, and that's not all planners are really interested in hearing this other perspective of the world where something like an earthquake is driving some of their zoning considerations. However, in King County, we are now finally integrating planning these hazard information into the planning process. And I think one of our inroads was really the climate change people, because they all got all this climate mitigation stuff in there. And it was all climate mitigation, which is greenhouse gas reduction, had nothing to do with the hazard risks that come along with it, which are the predominant local impact. And we said, that's nuts, guys. This greenhouse gas reduction stuff matters. definitely, but locally it's not going to make much difference. It's really how we incorporate hazards into it. And now we are seeing our countywide planning policies incorporate hazard stuff. So I don't think it takes the job of the emergency manager away. I think it expands the job of the emergency manager, makes us be the true opportunity of who we are, which is people that can talk and live in and be among all different people and understand that hazards, risks, and resilience are part of all different parts of community life.
Yeah, I'm just going to.
And Derek, that is, I'm so sorry to the panel because we are at time, and so we're going to have to go ahead and close this off. But I think those are beautiful words to end with, and I want to say a special thanks to Jim Schwab for the graceful way that you drew this panel together, and to the panelists for the questions that you posed in advance that Jim helped to bring together. We're actually going to post those as well, because we received some requests for people who are saying they'd like to engage in this kind of conversation at the state and local level. So thank you, Robin, Shanine, Derek, and Jim for this conversation. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. And I want to remind everyone, please, please, please hold the date for Tuesday, November 10th, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern for our next Making Mitigation Work webinar series. We are so fortunate to be joined by Alan Kwok with Philanthropy California, who is going to be talking to us about advancing racial and social equities through mitigating natural hazards. So keeping this amazing conversation that you all started today going. And so with that, thank you so much to our extraordinary panel. Thank you to all of our participants, and to all of you. Please remember to take care of yourself and others, and have a great day. Thank you.